I never believed in miracles until I witnessed one with my own eyes. What I'm about to share isn't just a story, it's a testament to something beyond our understanding, something that changed not only my life, but the lives of thousands. The day the sea rose against us and the earth trembled beneath our feet, I saw the impossible happen, a single chapel standing defiant amid total devastation. But this isn't just about a building that survived. It's about what happened inside those four walls when all hope seemed lost. My name is Hiroshi Tanaka, 52 years old, a former physics professor at Tokyo University. Science was my religion, empirical evidence, my scripture. I believed only in what could be measured, quantified, explained. God was, at best, a comforting fiction for those who couldn't face reality. I'm telling you this so you understand the magnitude of what I'm about to share, how the foundations of my worldview crumbled faster than the buildings around me that terrible day. It began with a dream 3 nights before the tsunami. I'd never experienced anything like it. Vivid, unsettling, impossible to dismiss as ordinary. In this dream, I stood on the shore of my hometown, Minami-Sanriku, watching the ocean recede impossibly far, exposing the seabed. An old man approached me, his face weathered like ancient wood, and pointed to a small wooden chapel on the hill. "When the water returns," he said, "remember where salvation stands." I woke drenched in sweat, the words echoing in my mind. I dismissed it as nothing more than anxiety about my upcoming visit home. I hadn't been back to Minami-Sanriku in nearly 5 years. My relationship with my father had deteriorated after my mother's death. He had turned to faith, I had turned away. But something, call it filial duty or this strange, persistent dream, compelled me to return. I took the bullet train from Tokyo, then the local line to the coast. With each kilometer, a strange weight settled in my chest. The dream kept replaying in my mind, and I found myself scanning the horizon for that chapel, though I couldn't recall seeing one in town before. When I arrived, Minami-Sanriku was as I remembered it, a peaceful fishing town nestled between mountains and sea. The March air was still crisp, cherry blossoms just beginning to bud. My father greeted me with the formal reserve that had defined our relationship for years. That evening, trying to bridge the silence between us, I mentioned my strange dream. His chopsticks froze halfway to his mouth. "The Chapel of Grace," he said quietly. "You've seen it." I learned then that a small Christian chapel had been built 3 years ago, overlooking the harbor. My father, to my astonishment, had become one of its members. "There's something special about that place," he said, with an earnestness I hadn't seen since before Mother's death. "Pastor Nakamura says it was built exactly where it needed to be. Come with me tomorrow morning." I agreed, more out of curiosity about this unexpected side of my father than any spiritual interest. The Chapel of Grace was smaller than I had imagined, a simple wooden structure with a modest steeple, perched on a bluff about 30 meters above sea level. What struck me immediately was how out of place it seemed in this traditionally Buddhist and Shinto community. Inside, perhaps 20 people gathered for the morning service. Pastor Nakamura was young, mid-30s, with an intensity in his eyes that made me uncomfortable. During his sermon, he spoke of preparation and shelter from storms to come. "This chapel stands as a lighthouse," he said, looking directly at me, a stranger in their midst. "When darkness comes, remember that God has positioned us precisely." After the service, my father introduced me to the congregation. An elderly woman clasped my hands and said something that sent ice through my veins. "You've come just in time." When I asked what she meant, she simply smiled and patted my hand. A young girl, no more than 7 or 8, tugged at my sleeve. "The water is coming," she whispered, "but don't be afraid. Angels hold this place." Her mother quickly pulled her away, apologizing for her imagination. But something in the child's clear-eyed certainty disturbed me deeply. That night I couldn't sleep. The chapel, the dream, the strange words of the congregants, it all swirled in my mind. At 2:46 a.m., I was still awake when the first tremor hit. Having lived in Japan all my life, I was accustomed to earthquakes, but within seconds I knew this was different. The shaking intensified until it seemed the world itself was tearing apart. I heard my father calling my name from the doorway of my room. "We need to get to higher ground," he shouted above the rumble. "Now!" We ran outside to chaos. Houses were collapsing. The ground cracked beneath our feet. And in the distance, the most terrifying sight I've ever witnessed. The ocean was retreating, exposing the seabed just as in my dream. Everyone in Minami Sanriku knew what this meant. "Tsunami!" people screamed, scrambling toward evacuation points. My father grabbed my arm. "The chapel," he said with absolute conviction. "We must go to the chapel." Logic told me to head for the designated evacuation center, but something stronger pulled me toward the chapel with my father. As we struggled uphill, I looked back to see the horizon darken, a wall of water rushing toward the shore. The tsunami warning sirens wailed across the town, their cry like a wounded animal. We weren't alone in our destination. Dozens of people streamed toward the chapel. Some I recognized from the morning service, others simply seeking the highest ground they could reach. Inside the chapel, panic reigned. People wept, prayed, held each other. Pastor Nakamura stood at the altar, his voice somehow cutting through the chaos. "We are not abandoned," he declared. "This place was built for this moment." The little girl from earlier sat calmly in the front pew, her hands folded in her lap. "The angels are here now," she announced with serene confidence. "I can see them holding the corners of the roof." Through the windows, we watched the impossible. The tsunami crashed into Minami Sanriku with apocalyptic force. Buildings dissolved like sugar cubes. Fishing boats became battering rams. The roar was deafening, like 100 freight trains. Then came the sound of splintering wood as water hit the buildings nearest to us. Pastor Nakamura began to sing a hymn, his voice unwavering. Incredibly, others joined in, their voices rising with the water outside. I stood frozen at the window, the scientist in me calculating our odds of survival. The chapel's wooden construction, its position, the force of the water, by every law of physics I knew, we would be swept away. The water surged up the hill, swallowing everything in its path. It reached the chapel steps. I closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable crash of water through the doors, the collapse of walls, the end, but it never came. The water rose to the very threshold of the chapel doors and stopped, as if held back by an invisible barrier. Outside, destruction continued unabated. Trees uprooted, cars tossed like toys, buildings crushed. But the chapel remained untouched, the waters parting around it like the Red Sea before Moses. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, looked again. It defied everything I understood about fluid dynamics, about force, about reality itself. "Look!" someone cried out. Through the chapel's stained glass windows, the afternoon sun had broken through storm clouds, casting prismatic light throughout the room. The colors danced on the walls, on our faces, moving in patterns that seemed almost intentional. Pastor Nakamura fell to his knees. "God's presence is here," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. And though I had never been a man of faith, I felt it too. An inexplicable warmth, a pressure of love like the depths of an ocean, but one that buoyed rather than crushed. The little girl walked calmly to the window and pressed her hand against the glass. "They're turning the water away," she said matter-of-factly. "The angels with fiery swords." An old fisherman next to me clutched his heart. "I see them," he gasped. "God help me, I see them too." I strained my eyes but saw only the churning water, yet something inside me responded to their words with recognition rather than skepticism. For 6 hours we remained in that chapel as the waters gradually receded. 6 hours of prayers, of testimonies, of a community being forged in the crucible of crisis. People spoke of visions, of figures of light surrounding the chapel, of a dome of protection visible only through tears. I said nothing, the scientist in me still struggling to process what my eyes had witnessed. But when my father took my hand and whispered, "Do you understand now why I needed faith after your mother died?" Something broke inside me. For the first time since her funeral, I wept openly. As evening approached, we finally ventured outside. The devastation was total. Where Minami Sanriku had stood that morning, there was now only debris and mud and silence. The tsunami had erased my hometown from the map, except for one building. The Chapel of Grace stood untouched, not a shingle missing, not a window broken. Around it, like a perfect circle, the ground was dry. Physics told me this was impossible. Yet I stood upon the impossible, my feet dry on ground that should have been swallowed by the sea. What happened next defies explanation even more. As rescue workers finally reached our location the following day, they couldn't believe what they found. This entire area was underwater, one worker insisted, checking his map. Satellite imagery shows nothing standing. Yet there we were, nearly 100 survivors in a chapel that, according to their data, no longer existed. Word spread quickly. Media arrived, then government officials, then scientists. I found myself in the strange position of being both subject and investigator, my scientific credentials making me the default spokesperson for a miracle I myself could barely comprehend. Seismologists, structural engineers, hydraulic experts, all came to examine the chapel, all left with more questions than answers. The building's construction was ordinary. The ground beneath it showed no special geological features that might have diverted the tsunami. By all accounts, the chapel should have been the first structure to be destroyed, not the only one to survive. Then came the discovery that shook me to my core. Among the rescue workers was a man named Kenji who stared at the chapel with particular intensity. When I approached him, he showed me a photograph on his phone, a picture of his grandfather who had been a carpenter. "He designed this chapel," Kenji said. "The night before he died 3 years ago, he told me he'd had a vision of a great wave and that God had shown him how to build a sanctuary that would withstand it." The face in the photograph was hauntingly familiar, the same weathered features as the old man in my dream. More inexplicable events followed. People injured in the tsunami who were brought to the chapel reported extraordinary recoveries. A child trapped under debris for 2 days without water showed no signs of dehydration after being carried into the chapel. The little girl, whose name I learned was Grace, continued to speak of angels with such conviction that even hardened rescue workers found themselves listening. Most remarkable was the transformation of those who had opposed the chapel's construction. The town mayor, who had fought against the building permit years earlier, was among those saved within its walls. I watched this proud man, who had previously mocked the small Christian congregation, fall to his knees before Pastor Nakamura. "I was wrong," he sobbed. "Forgive me." The pastor embraced him, and together they prayed in the rubble of what had once been the mayor's office. In the weeks that followed, as relief efforts continued and the painful process of recovery began, the Chapel of Grace became more than just a shelter. It became a symbol. People came from across Japan, then from around the world. Buddhists prayed beside Christians. Shinto priests stood alongside Muslim imams. The barriers that typically separate faiths seemed to dissolve in the presence of something that transcended explanation. The Japanese government, initially hesitant to acknowledge the chapel's inexplicable survival, eventually designated it as a special historical site. Scientists published papers proposing theories, unusual wave patterns, unforeseen geological structures, but even their most complex models failed to account for the perfect preservation of the building and the sharp demarcation between destruction and safety that surrounded it. For me, the journey was deeply personal. I, who had built my life on the foundation of empirical evidence, had witnessed something that existed beyond the reach of my instruments and equations. One evening, alone in the chapel after the crowds had gone, I sat in silence, wrestling with everything I had seen, everything I had felt. Pastor Nakamura found me there, sitting beside me without speaking for a long while. "You still seek an explanation," he finally said. It wasn't a question. "I'm a scientist," I replied. "It's what I do." He nodded. "Science asks how. Faith asks why. Perhaps we need both questions." That night I stayed in the chapel, sleeping on one of the pews. In my dreams, I saw my mother, her face peaceful, her hand extended toward me. "The answers you seek aren't found in either complete faith or complete doubt," she said. "They're found in the humble space between knowing and wondering." I woke with the first light, tears on my face, and a certainty in my heart that I couldn't articulate. Something had shifted within me. Not a wholesale abandonment of science for faith, but an expansion of my understanding to include possibilities I had previously refused to consider. In the year since the tsunami, Minamisanriku has begun to rebuild. The Chapel of Grace remains at its center, both literally and symbolically. Where once stood a struggling congregation of 20, now hundreds gather each week. The story of the chapel has spread across Japan, then throughout Asia, then globally. Documentaries have been filmed, books written. Some seek to explain away the miracle, others come simply to stand in its presence and wonder. I no longer teach physics at the university. Instead, I've established a research center near the chapel, a place where scientists and theologians can work together to explore the questions that exist at the intersection of our disciplines. My father serves as one of the chapel's elders now, and our relationship has been restored in ways I never thought possible. The walls between us crumbled more completely than the buildings around the chapel ever did. Grace, the little girl who saw angels, is 10 now. She still speaks of them occasionally with the same matter-of-fact certainty. "They never left," she told me recently. "They're still here. You just have to learn how to see." I'm learning, slowly, to see through different eyes. Last week, a young physicist visited our research center. She came armed with skepticism and complicated equipment, determined to find the real explanation for the chapel's survival. I recognized myself in her. The insistence on measurable evidence, the dismissal of testimonials as subjective and unreliable. I didn't try to convince her otherwise. I simply invited her to stay a while, to listen to the stories, to stand inside the chapel and feel whatever she might feel. On her third day, I found her sitting alone in the chapel, her equipment untouched, tears streaming down her face. "I don't understand what's happening to me," she whispered when I sat beside her. "I came to disprove a miracle, and instead, the miracle is happening within you," I finished for her. Her name was Dr. Yumi Watanabe, an accomplished physicist from Kyoto University. She stayed for 3 months. What began as a scientific investigation became a spiritual pilgrimage. Her preliminary paper, published in the Journal of Seismological Research, sent shockwaves through the scientific community. While conventional analysis fails to explain the structural integrity of the Chapel of Grace during the 2023 tsunami, she wrote, the consistency of eyewitness accounts suggests phenomena worthy of serious scientific inquiry beyond our current paradigms. She faced ridicule from some colleagues, but others, more than you might expect, contacted her privately, sharing similar experiences they'd never had the courage to document professionally. I think often of the days immediately following the tsunami, when the full magnitude of the miracle was still unfolding. The third morning after the disaster, a group of rescue workers approached the chapel, leading a man whose eyes were bandaged. He had been pulled from rubble 10 kilometers away, his eyes damaged by debris and seawater. His family was missing. He had heard rumors of the chapel and begged to be brought there. Pastor Nakamura welcomed him, praying over him with gentle hands. When the bandages were removed the next day, the doctors were stunned to find his eyes completely healed. "I can see," he wept. "I can see everything so clearly now." His words carried a weight beyond the physical. That same week, a journalist from a major Tokyo newspaper arrived, determined to debunk what he called disaster superstition. Takeshi Yamamoto had built his career on exposés of religious charlatans and faith healers. He interviewed me for hours, his questions razor sharp, looking for inconsistencies, for the trick behind the miracle. Buildings don't survive tsunamis because of prayer, he insisted. There's always a scientific explanation. I didn't argue, just suggested he speak with others, especially Grace, the child who had seen angels. I wasn't present for their conversation, but I saw him afterwards, sitting alone on a pile of debris where the town hall had once stood. His notebook was open, but his pen was still. His face had the stunned look of a man whose foundations had shifted. 2 days later, his article was published. Not the exposé he had planned, but a thoughtful, almost reverent piece titled "The Questions Without Answers." He wrote of Grace, "When a child speaks of angels with such clarity that doubt itself feels foolish, one must consider that our sophisticated dismissals may be the true naivete." Yamamoto returned many times over the following months, documenting the chapel phenomenon with meticulous care. He eventually left his position at the newspaper to write a book, which became an international bestseller, translated into 27 languages. The Chapel That Heaven Saved brought our story to millions. When criticized for abandoning journalistic objectivity, he responded simply, "I didn't abandon objectivity. I expanded it to include the full range of human experience, including the inexplicable." The little girl, Grace, became central to everything that unfolded. I learned more about her as weeks passed. She was the daughter of a single mother who had moved to Minami-Sanriku just 1 year before the tsunami. She had always been a quiet child, somewhat isolated from her peers, but with an uncanny perception that sometimes unnerved adults. After the tsunami, her abilities, there's no other word for them, intensified. She would know when survivors would be found before rescue teams departed. She could sense when someone was in particular spiritual distress and would silently go to them, taking their hand. Most remarkably, she began to draw images of the town as it would be rebuilt, with astonishing architectural detail no 7-year-old should possess. Engineers who saw her drawings were baffled by their sophisticated understanding of earthquake-resistant design principles. When gently questioned about where these ideas came from, she would smile and say, "The angels show me while I sleep." One prominent architect from Tokyo incorporated several of her concepts into the town's reconstruction plans, later admitting they represented innovations his team hadn't considered. As word of the chapel miracle spread, the reactions were as varied as humanity itself. Religious pilgrims came by the thousands, Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, Hindus, spiritual seekers of every description. Some arrived skeptical and left transformed. Others came already believing and found their faith deepened. A few left disappointed, having expected more dramatic displays of the supernatural rather than the quiet power that permeated the place. Scientists came too, geologists, physicists, structural engineers, even neurologists, studying the brains of those who reported mystical experiences in the chapel. Their conclusions varied wildly. Some proposed complex theories about underwater geographical formations that might have diverted the tsunami's force. Others suggested mass hysteria or false memory syndrome. A few of the more courageous ones simply acknowledged that something had occurred that defied current scientific frameworks. The Japanese government's response evolved over time. Initially embarrassed by the international attention to what officials privately dismissed as superstitious thinking, they attempted to control the narrative by emphasizing natural explanations. But as more evidence accumulated, not just testimonies, but physical measurements showing anomalies in how the tsunami had behaved around the chapel, their positions softened. The Ministry of Education eventually funded a multidisciplinary research initiative called the Boundary Studies Project, explicitly designed to investigate phenomena that existed at the borders of scientific understanding. I was asked to lead this project, a position I accepted with both humility and trepidation. My team included physicists, theologians, psychologists, and indigenous wisdom keepers from various traditions. Our mission wasn't to prove miracles. Such an approach would have been methodologically flawed from the start, but to expand the boundaries of inquiry to include experiences typically dismissed by conventional science. The chapel became our primary case study, but we investigated other instances globally where the inexplicable had intersected with the measurable. Not everyone welcomed our work. I received death threats from religious extremists who believed we were dissecting God's mysteries. Simultaneously, I was denounced by certain scientific colleagues as having abandoned rationality for mysticism. Both accusations missed the point entirely. We were not trying to reduce mystery to measurement, nor elevate every unexplained phenomenon to miracle status. We were simply acknowledging that human experience is broader and deeper than our current frameworks, both scientific and religious, can fully capture. 6 months after the tsunami, something happened that challenged even my expanding understanding. A group of fishermen, the first to attempt returning to the sea since the disaster, encountered trouble when an unexpected storm arose. Their boat began taking on water about 2 kilometers offshore. The captain, who had lost his father and brother in the tsunami, found himself frozen in terror as waves crashed over the vessel. Then he reported he saw a column of light extending from the Chapel of Grace across the water to their boat. Within this light, he claimed, the water calmed in a perfect circle around them. The other fishermen corroborated his account. More significantly, coastal radar records showed an unexplained disturbance pattern in the water, precisely where they had been struggling. A circular area of reduced wave activity that meteorologists could not explain through wind patterns or ocean currents. When they returned safely to shore, the men went directly to the chapel, falling to their knees in gratitude. The captain, who had previously avoided the religious nonsense surrounding the chapel, became one of its most devoted attendees. Such occurrences, impossible to verify completely yet equally impossible to dismiss, continued with surprising regularity. A child with leukemia, whose condition reversed after her parents brought her to pray in the chapel. A suicidal teenager who reported seeing a person made of light, who spoke words of comfort that gave him reason to live. Couples struggling with infertility who conceived after visiting. Hardened skeptics who experienced sudden, inexplicable peace that altered their life trajectory. Were these coincidences, placebo effects, the power of suggestion, or genuine spiritual interventions? Our research team documented everything, maintaining rigorous standards but refusing to impose premature conclusions. We are cartographers of the unknown, I told my team. Our job is to map the territory faithfully, not to claim we understand all its features. My personal journey continued to evolve alongside the research. 1 year after the tsunami, I had another dream, as vivid as the one that had first drawn me back to Minami Sanriku. In this dream, I stood inside the chapel, but its walls were transparent, revealing countless threads of golden light connecting it to places all over the world. At the center stood my mother, young as I remembered her from childhood, her face radiant. The chapel was never about the building, she said. It was always about the connections. When I woke, I understood something that had eluded me. The miracle wasn't contained within those walls. It was expanding outward, touching lives I would never know. The rebuilding of Minami Sanriku progressed slowly but with remarkable intentionality. Unlike other disaster-affected communities where reconstruction often replicated what was lost, our town embraced transformation. The new urban plan, developed with community input, placed the Chapel of Grace at its center, with neighborhoods radiating outward like ripples on water. Buildings incorporated not only advanced earthquake and tsunami-resistant features, but spaces specifically designed for community gathering and mutual support. More surprising was the social transformation. Minami Sanriku had previously been like many Japanese rural communities, aging, traditional, somewhat resistant to change. After the tsunami, it became a living laboratory for new ways of being community. Former social hierarchies flattened. Young people who might have left for cities returned to participate in the rebuilding. The town became remarkably diverse, with people from across Japan and around the world drawn to be part of its resurrection. Traditional religious boundaries softened as well. The Buddhist temple, rebuilt near the Chapel of Grace, established a wisdom exchange program with the Christian congregation. Shinto priests participated in interfaith ceremonies marking key moments in the town's recovery. One elderly Shinto priest, when asked about this unprecedented cooperation, explained, "When you have seen what we have seen, you understand that the divine speaks through many voices, but with one heart." My father experienced his own profound transformation. Once a quiet, emotionally reserved man, typical of his generation, he became a community elder whose counsel was sought by many. His faith, once private and unobtrusive, became a wellspring from which others drew strength. He established a support group for those who had lost family members, creating a space where grief could be expressed and carried collectively. "The wave took much from us," he often said, "but what it left behind is more precious than what was lost." Our relationship healed in ways I could never have imagined. One evening, sitting on the newly built pier overlooking the bay where so many had perished, he turned to me with tears in his eyes. "I was wrong to withdraw after your mother died," he said. "I thought faith was a private shelter, but now I understand it's meant to be a bridge." We embraced there, the setting sun turning the water to gold, our shadows merging into one. As the second anniversary of the tsunami approached, we planned a remembrance ceremony at the chapel. Survivors from Minami Sanriku would be joined by representatives from other disaster-affected communities around the Pacific Rim, places that had experienced their own tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions. The idea had come from Grace, now 9 years old, who had said with characteristic directness, "The angels want everyone who has lost something to come together." Preparations were extensive. The chapel, though unchanged structurally since the tsunami, was enhanced with a memorial garden where the names of those lost were engraved on stones arranged in concentric circles. A bell tower was constructed nearby, housing a massive bronze bell cast from objects recovered from the tsunami debris, fishing equipment, household items, even a school bell found 5 kilometers inland. The symbolism was powerful, destruction transformed into something that could call people to remembrance and hope. The night before the ceremony, I couldn't sleep. Walking to the chapel in pre-dawn darkness, I was surprised to find I wasn't alone. A group had gathered spontaneously, about 30 people sitting in silence, some praying, others simply present with their memories and emotions. No one had organized this vigil. People had simply felt drawn to be there. I took a seat among them, this community that had been forged in the crucible of catastrophe. As dawn broke, something extraordinary happened. The rising sun aligned perfectly with the chapel's eastern window, sending a beam of golden light directly to the altar. This architectural feature hadn't been planned. The chapel had been built years before by a simple carpenter with no training in solar alignment. Yet there it was, a shaft of light so bright it seemed solid, illuminating dust motes that danced like stars in its path. Within this column of light, several people, myself included, saw something that defies easy description, a shimmering, a movement, a presence that was both within the light and somehow constituting it. Grace, who was sitting near the front, stood up and walked directly into the beam. The light seemed to adhere to her small form, surrounding her with a golden aura. "They're here," she said simply. "Everyone we've lost, everyone we'll find again." Several people gasped. An elderly woman began to weep softly. A teenage boy who had lost both parents in the tsunami whispered, "Mom, Dad." The moment held us in a suspension of time where past, present, and future seemed to exist simultaneously. I felt my mother's presence so strongly I could almost smell the jasmine scent she had always worn. The formal ceremony later that day was attended by hundreds, including government officials, religious leaders, and media from around the world. But it was the informal, unplanned dawn gathering that most participants would later describe as the true heart of the commemoration. Something had passed between us in those moments, something that transcended words and dogmas and explanations. The physicist in me continues to seek understanding. The spiritual seeker in me has learned to rest in mystery. These aspects no longer feel contradictory, but complementary, different faculties for perceiving a reality too vast for any single perspective. I continue to lead research at the Boundary Studies Institute we established near the chapel. Our work has expanded to include investigations of other boundary experiences, near-death experiences, profound meditation states, collective consciousness events during disasters or celebrations. 3 years after the tsunami, our findings were presented at a special United Nations symposium on disaster resilience and recovery. What began as a scientific presentation became something much more as survivors from Minamisan-riku shared their experiences. The typically reserved diplomatic audience was visibly moved. A delegate from a war-torn nation approached me afterwards, tears in his eyes. "My country needs a chapel," he said, not meaning a building, but the spirit of what had happened in our community. This has been the most unexpected development, how the story of one small coastal town and its inexplicably preserved chapel has sparked a global conversation about resilience, faith, and the hidden connections that bind us. Delegations from disaster-prone regions around the world have visited Minamisan-riku to study not just our physical rebuilding strategies, but the social and spiritual dimensions of our recovery. Grace, now entering her adolescence, has become something of an ambassador for what some have called the Minamisan-riku way. Despite her youth, she speaks with remarkable clarity about what she experienced and continues to experience. When a skeptical interviewer from an international science magazine challenged her to explain how she could be certain about her angel encounters, she replied, "I'm as certain of them as you are of your doubt. The difference is, I've remained open to changing my certainty." The interview was published unedited, with the journalist noting he had no adequate response to her statement. As for the Chapel of Grace itself, it remains unchanged physically, a simple wooden structure that somehow withstood forces that leveled reinforced concrete buildings. Scientifically, we have documented unusual electromagnetic readings inside the building, distinctive acoustic properties that amplify certain frequency ranges associated with meditative states, and what one researcher called anomalous light behavior in how sunlight refracts through its windows. None of these explain its survival, but they contribute to the growing body of evidence that this place exists somehow at the intersection of the physical and something else. Visitors often report the same sequence of sensations upon entering. First, an unexpected silence, as if the ambient noise of the world has been gently muted. Then, a distinctive pressure in the chest that many describe as not unpleasant, like being embraced. Finally, an emotional response that varies widely. Some weep, some laugh, many experience a profound sense of peace. EEG readings of people inside the chapel show patterns remarkably similar to those observed in long-term meditators, even in individuals with no meditation experience. My own relationship with the chapel has evolved over the years. I no longer seek answers there, but renewal. Weekly, I sit in the same pew where I sheltered during the tsunami, not to relive the terror of that day, but to reconnect with the moment when everything I thought I understood was swept away, creating space for a larger truth. Sometimes I sense my mother's presence. Sometimes I feel nothing beyond my own breathing. I've learned that both experiences have value. Pastor Nakamura continues to lead the congregation, which has grown to several hundred regular attendees. His sermons have changed over the years, becoming less doctrinal and more experiential. "We are not here to claim exclusive truth," he said recently, "but to witness to a mystery that has claimed us." The chapel welcomes people of all faiths and none. What matters is not theological agreement, but openness to the inexplicable that touched this place and continues to touch those who enter it. My father, now in his 80s, has become a treasured elder in our community. Children gather around him for stories. Tourists seek his blessing. Fellow survivors find comfort in his quiet strength. Watching him, I see echoes of the man I knew in childhood, before grief hardened him, but also someone new, someone tempered by suffering, but not defined by it. "The tsunami took half my life," he told me on his 80th birthday, "but gave me a greater one in return." As for me, the journey continues. I have not abandoned science. I still conduct research, publish papers, engage with the academic community, but I've expanded my understanding of what constitutes valid inquiry and meaningful knowledge. I no longer dismiss subjective experience as inherently less valuable than objective measurement. Both tell us something important about reality. Both have limitations. The young physicist who came to disprove the miracle stayed for years, eventually becoming my colleague and dear friend. Dr. Yumi Watanabe's work has helped establish a new field of inquiry, some call consciousness studies, others spiritual physics. Regardless of terminology, it represents an attempt to bring rigor to questions previously abandoned to pure faith or dismissed as delusion. She recently told me, "Before Minami Sanriku, I studied the universe as if it were separate from me. Now I understand I'm studying a reality that includes me as both observer and participant." This integration of seemingly opposite perspectives, scientific and spiritual, objective and subjective, intellectual and experiential, represents perhaps the most important lesson of the Chapel of Grace. The miracle wasn't just that a building survived when it shouldn't have. The miracle is that this event created a space where artificial divisions could dissolve, where a more comprehensive understanding could emerge. This is what I've come to understand. The true miracle of the Chapel of Grace isn't just that it remained standing when all else fell. The true miracle is what happens inside those who encounter it. The falling away of certainties, the opening of closed minds, the healing of wounded hearts. Something profound happens in that space between what we can explain and what we can only experience. I don't know why my hometown was destroyed while this one building was spared. I don't know why I was given a dream that prepared me, however inadequately, for what was to come. I don't have answers for the families who lost everything, homes, livelihoods, loved ones. Their pain and questions remain valid and vital. But I do know that in the midst of unfathomable destruction, many found something they weren't even looking for. A faith that transcends understanding, a community that transcends differences, a hope that transcends circumstances. Now I'm speaking to you. Yes, you who are reading these words. Perhaps you came seeking evidence of a miracle, or perhaps you came to dismiss one. Perhaps you're standing in your own tsunami, a diagnosis, a loss, a failure, a crisis of faith. I can't promise you that your chapel will remain standing while all else is swept away, but I can tell you this. Sometimes the most profound truths reveal themselves precisely when our certainties are washed away. The Chapel of Grace stands today not just as a testament to what happened during those terrifying hours when the sea rose against us. It stands as an invitation to wonder, to question, to believe in possibilities beyond our understanding. Whatever storm you face, know that you are not alone in it. There are mysteries in this world that science cannot yet explain, and miracles that faith alone cannot fully contain. The truth, I believe, resides in the humble recognition that we are small creatures in a vast universe, yet somehow, inexplicably, deeply loved. Come to Minami Sanriku. Stand within the walls that defied a tsunami. Feel what I felt. See what I've seen. And perhaps, like me, you'll discover that the greatest miracles aren't those that defy the laws of nature, but those that transform the human heart. For in the end, this is what remains when all else is swept away: love, community, the courage to hope, and the humility to wonder. In the chapel that heaven saved, I found something far greater than an explanation. I found my way home.